Hey guys, I'm Ted, here to give you another fast fact, and for this fast fact, we are going, not fast fact, I'm sorry, I apologize, I got a little mixed up there. Well, this is a lecture. For this lecture, we are going to discuss the movement to succeed. But before we do that, I just like to do our customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we discussed the Democratic nomination convention, all the problems they had in Charleston, and then also later in Baltimore. And we also discussed the Republican the Republican nomination convention, and how Lincoln was sort of the second choice. Lincoln wasn't the front runner for the election; he was the afterthought. To look at it like that, he was the compromise candidate. And lastly, in our previous lecture, we discussed how Lincoln managed to win the election. He won with a minority of the popular vote, but an overwhelming majority in the Electoral College. From there, we'll pick up with our lecture series with the reaction to Lincoln's election. Now, after Lincoln won the election, after the election of 1860, the Democratic Party still retained control of the federal Senate and the House of Representatives. But this was really of little comfort to the slave states. They openly began to voice their displeasure with a party and a president who they contended had no support in the slave states and now controlled the executive branch of the federal government. Notwithstanding that party platform had called for prohibiting for a massive scale prohibition of slavery in the federal territories, they quickly pointed out that the Republican Party contained people who were known to have been sympathetic towards John Brown and his planned slave uprising, either advocates of personal liberty laws or abolitionists, people who were devoted to destroying slavery, and by de facto, people who were devoted to the destruction of the social class ordering and economic foundation and principles of the slave states. Now, the slave states were long accustomed to controlling the executive branch with long successions of Virginians, Tennesseans, and dough-faced Democrats. This was deeply troubling for the slavocrats. They now began to see a vision of the future where the free states were riding roughshod over the slave states, and using their higher population to take control of Congress and remake the Supreme Court with anti-slavery justices. Their biggest fear was that if they were kept from power by the free states long enough, the free states would eventually strike at slavery where it already existed. In the free states, there was no patience for any of this sort of like rampant fear-mongering by the slave states leaders. There was no attempt to reconcile these fears. There was no patience and no attempts to reconcile the fears of the slavocrats. They responded by saying that the slave power had been in charge for over 30 years, and that there were more citizens living in the free states. They looked back to their conduct in the aftermath of elections they had lost, and they stated that they had played by the rules and they had not cried foul. And the free states, especially Republicans in the free states, explicitly stated their expectation that the slave states play by the rules and behave themselves. Now, in the month following the election, Lincoln is elected in November of 1860, and in December of 1860, there arose the beginnings of the movement for secession, and it arose in South Carolina, which wasn't very surprising, but very unsurprising that it would be South Carolina who have been the most profound in their pro-slavery stance to lead this charge. South Carolina, after all, had the highest population of African Americans in the Republic. Now, the South Carolina State Legislature called for a convention, again to be held in Charleston, and voted unanimously on December 20th, 1860, to secede from the Republic. Over the next 6 weeks, 6 other slave states voted to secede from the Republic: Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. They all voted. And in Texas, Sam Houston, the old leading figure from the Mexican War, the Texan Mexican War, the Texas War of Independence, as it's called, he was the sitting governor. He was the sitting governor, and he opposed secession. He was what we refer to as a unionist, someone who favors staying in the Union and avoiding the issue or the topic of succession. Sam Houston is the sitting governor, but he's an anti-secessionist governor. He's opposing it. He refused to acknowledge when the Texas legislature held their convention for secession and they passed their ordinance of secession. He refused to acknowledge it, and as a result, he was promptly removed from office by the Texas state legislature, who then elevated the lieutenant governor to the position of governor. Now, the pro-secession feeling in these states were not unanimous. There were people in the slave states who favored a wait-and-see strategy. They were called cooperationists. Now, they were not against secession. They simply wanted to wait and have all of the slave states act in concert with one another. At this point, the 7 states of the Deep South, the 7 deep slave states, did not have enough cooperation to carry the day. So the fire eaters and their supporters swept the day, and those states left. Now, the seceding states declared that the federal government was a union of sovereign states, and that the states retained the prerogative to leave the republic at any time if the agreement was broken. Now, the seceding states pointed out that they entered the republic in good faith, and now the national government, the government in D.C., had turned against them. They pointed to free state refusal to return fugitive slaves, the support shown to John Brown, and the abolition movement. They pointed to these elements of the free states as indicative of the free states' disregard for their future and the present well-being. It was their right to withdraw under these circumstances, they insisted. Now, interestingly enough, the United States Constitution does not offer a clear answer on whether a state can withdraw under these circumstances. The United States Constitution doesn't really give any indication that a state can withdraw from the Union. And lawyers from the slave and the free states argued about the legality of succession then as they do now. Now, the remaining 8 states, 8 slave states, Virginia, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, stayed in the Republic. At this point, we're in February of 1861. The last state to leave the Union left on the 1st of February. In February of 1861, the seceding states met in Montgomery, Alabama, and they met to adopt a provisional constitution to create a new pro-slavery republic that they named the Confederate States of America. And from this point on, I will draw the distinction between the free states, who I will now refer to as the United States, and the former and the succeeding slave states, who I will now refer to as the Confederate States. Now, the slave states that remain in the United States, I will refer that did not succeed and join the Confederate States, I will continue to refer to as the slave states, to sort of give some clarity on the terms that are used later on in our lecture series. Now they met. Now these states, the Confederate States of America, are meeting in Montgomery. They're holding what's known as the Montgomery Convention, and it is controlled by moderates who write a constitution that was very closely modeled on the United States Constitution, with the exception that slavery was explicitly protected and called for increased states' rights, forbade the central government from passing protective tariffs or funding internal improvements. Really, when you look at their constitution, it is the antithesis, the exact opposite of the Republican platform in 1860. The fire eaters are excluded, the moderates are in control, but the document they produce is very reactionary when you examine it. Now, the former United States Secretary of War and Congressman Jefferson Davis was chosen to be the first president of the Confederate States, and Alexander Hamilton Stevens, a noted cooperationist, was chosen to be the first vice president of the Confederate States. Now, both men were chosen because of their known moderate stances. Now, the plan on the leaders at the Montgomery Convention, the plan was to use the moderate leaders to entice the remaining slave states still in the United States to join the Confederate States. The Montgomery delegates issued statements insisting that they were returning to the original plan of the United States founding fathers, because the Republicans, and by extension the free states, the United States, had conducted a revolution on them. They insisted that their purpose was to preserve their system of social order and labor that was based on slavery and a racial caste. They simply wanted to preserve that system. Now, the Democrats are still in control of Congress at the time, and the Democrats were the party of the southern states. They're still in control of Congress at the time. The Republican platform called for leaving slavery alone where it already existed. The Slavocrats took a big risk in succeeding. After the war, prominent Confederates made a great showing of arguing that the war was about constitutional issues. But in 1860 and 1861, there was no doubt, there was no confusion. No one from the Confederate camp was arguing constitutional rights. And to highlight this, Alexander Hamilton Stevens, the cooperationist vice president of the Confederate States, gave a memorable speech that placed slavery at the heart of the issue of succession. In March of 1861, a month after the new government and the new nation, the new republic is proclaimed, he stated, our new government is founded upon, and its foundations rest upon, the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery of the subordinate to the superior race is his natural and moral condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world to be based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. That is Alexander Hamilton Stevens, the vice president of the Confederacy, in 1861. Now, Stevens would go on after the war to argue that it was not slavery. He would go on to contradict himself after the war in 1868 when he argued that it was constitutional rights. Stevens is a figure that looms large in what's called the myth of the lost cause, and that is the apologist, that is the writers in retrospect, descendants of prominent Confederate figures and also prominent Confederate figures themselves, their writings to sort of justify succession and to sort of paint them in a better picture to sort of give them a better standing historically. Now, the United States opted for a wait-and-see policy to the activities of the slave states. Many in the United States took to believing that the Republic had been created by the people, not the states, and that the will of the people was the dominant element in the Republic. State sovereignty was in this case rejected by many people in the United States and in the remaining states of the United States. Now, many in the United States also thought that succession threatened the overall mission of the United States, and that idea of the United States being exceptional was known as American exceptionalism. That everyone believed that the Republic was a democratic beacon that shone to the decadent and backward portions of the world. The prevailing thought was that if the succeeding states were allowed to just lead the republic, the mission would fail. With that said, no one was ready to take drastic measures, that is, use force at this point. We're in March of 1861. The sitting president, James Buchanan, was not willing to use force to corral the succeeding states back into the republic. Buchanan voiced his opinion, and his opinion was this: succession was illegal, but he was powerless to do anything to act against the succeeding states because they had not actively engaged in violence against the United States. And he brought up a good point. These states, his opinion was that these states had not left the Union. They had not attacked United States installations. He had sent a resupply mission into United States property held in what the Confederate states were claiming was their territory. He stated that these were simply guys stomping their feet. They hadn't done anything illegal, that their documents weren't legal, and that they were still in the United States. That was Buchanan's position. Now, at this point, there is no armed rebellion. As I stated earlier, there was no violence. No one they had not attacked United States military outposts in the South. There was no violence against the United States. There was no armed conflict. The states were simply voicing their perceived rights. The new Congress was not scheduled to meet until December of 1861, but the current Congress was at work trying to moderate an end to the secession movement. Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky tried to reach a compromise. One of his suggestions was simply to extend the old 3630 line, that old proposal of James Polk of extending that 3630, the Missouri Compromise line, all the way to the Pacific. That was one of his proposals, simply taking up and putting into action what Polk had proposed nearly 15 years prior. Well, not 15. Let me say 12 years prior. That was his proposal, and this would have opened up New Mexico and the Utah territories to slavery. He also proposed a constitutional amendment that would have permanently protected slavery where it already existed. And Buchanan thought these were great compromises. Buchanan thought that would need to compromise, that they had solved the issue forever of slavery. However, the incoming Republicans and the majority of the remaining states in the United States rejected the proposals. No extension of slavery in the territories had been a major selling point for the Republican Party in the past election, in the recent election. They could not accept extending slavery. They could not accept extending that Missouri Compromise line. They refused to compromise, and they did not see why they had to. They reiterated that they won the last election and that there was more of them in the Republic, that they should not have to consistently compromise. Lincoln, who had kept a low profile throughout most of the crisis, most of the blowback from his election, did let it be known that he was not in favor of extending the compromise line as well. Now, many slave state extremists, they also refused the Crittenden Compromise as well, because they wanted slavery to be permitted in the entire republic. They also were unwilling to compromise. Now, the demands of the Republicans and the Slavocrats were irreconcilable at this point. And also beginning to be drawn into this issue of slavery with the economic development of the national economy. Many in the free states believed that slavery retarded, that is, held back, did not allow the republic's national economy to reach its full potential. They believed that slavery was a hindrance to the nation's industrial output, and really that slave power was just a cheap shot at the practice of free labor. Many in the free states were also upset that that slavery gave the seceding states, the slave states, gave them a disproportionate amount of representation in Congress. Now, the slave states believe that they will be rendered second-class citizens in the Republic if slavery was limited to where it already existed. And if slavery was hemmed in, it would cease to be a dynamic part of the Republic, and thus they will be held captive by the free states. And at this point, we'll break our lecture. We'll break our lecture and we'll come back with another lecture. And as always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. Let me know your opinions on this. This is it's still a very heated topic, still a very heated debate subject in the contemporary United States. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, comment. I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.